Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Chapter 1, Section 1. Sir Neville Fanning was doing at least 3 things at once in the private dining room of the Hotel Emanuele in the Via Veneto in the city of Rome. He was eating an excellent luncheon, he was observing his fellow guests, and he was giving as much attention to Mrs. Bessington's conversation as that lady required. It cannot be said that Mrs. Bessington was easy to talk to. In fact, that was an impossible feat. He had tried it in the first days of his acquaintance with her, and even now, when he forgot, tried it still. But he had found that she neither needed his remarks nor even wished for them. All she required was silence, noddings of the head, and very occasional accents or monosyllabic questions. She did all the rest. It was a little stupefying at first to be pelted with such an interminable torrent of words. He had at first resisted a little, seriously believing that she might possibly wish to hear what he had to say. Then he had grown a little impatient, and then the divine gift of humour had saved him. And henceforth, except, as has been said, when he forgot, he sat still, now marvelling at the spate of talk that flowed forth so sedately, now deliberately thinking about other things, now occasionally playing a sort of intellectual solitaire, which consisted in counting her full stops. There had only been 5 during the whole of the Kardec course, from the moment she took up her fork to the moment she laid it down again, and once, with an exquisite joy, switching her on to the Marchioness Daly, his hostess, who sat on his left and whose horsepower, so to speak, very nearly, but not quite, rivaled Mrs. Bessington's. He believed that she was talking now about a cousin of hers who lived in Corfu, but he was not sure. If it was not she, it was Selva, the actress, who was in Rome just now. Certainly a female cousin had been mentioned a while ago, and so had Corfu. But an aunt had shot up from the horizon once or twice, and he was not certain, therefore, as to which occupied the place of honour at present. A Scotch maid of hers, too, called Macpherson, not the Scotch maid she had now, but another one, had certainly been spoken of. But it surely could not be she who was now curtsying to the late King of Greece and tripping over her train as she did so. "Most interesting," said Sir Neville, bringing his eyes back from their excursion. "How very— but that's not the end," pursued Mrs. Bessington, undismayed. "It was a fortnight after that. No, it couldn't have been that fortnight, because I know she caught influenza from having to wait about for the carriage, and she was laid up for 3 weeks. It must have been—" She was off again, and once more the young man began to look gingerly about him. He could not quite make out his hostess. He had a lamentable habit of pigeonholing his new acquaintances, and each pigeonhole had a little label over it, with a sort of inscription. Into these, then, he was accustomed to place people. At first he had been inclined, in view of their common possession of an almost infinite store of words and opinions on every subject, to place the Papal Marchioness and Mrs. Bessington together. They both talked unceasingly. They both wore a glassy expression of inattention when anyone compelled them to listen in return. The encounter between the two had been a glorious experience. He had been stung by the splendour of the prospect, and had wondered which would win. It was the ancient dilemma of striking impenetrable armour with a sword that could pierce everything. He had blinked a little as the 2 ladies discharged their conversational hoses across him. But he had enjoyed it. Mrs. Bessington had won. The impenetrability of her inattention had prevailed over the shrill and ceaseless arrows of the Marchioness' high voice, and she had been left discoursing on her favourite clergyman at the American Episcopal Church, while the Marchioness sulked. But he was beginning to discern a difference between them. Mrs. Bessington was always amiable. She never gravely attacked people's characters. She was harmless and bland, though quite shrewd in her opinions, while the Marchioness had an undercurrent of acidity, and seemed to take a kind of peevish delight in discerning and thrusting a pin through little cracks and holes in reputations. He saw that plainly now. It was evident that they could not be put in the same pigeonhole. Superficially, they might have been twins. Fundamentally, they were not even sisters. He scarcely knew how he happened to be here today. He had come out all alone to Rome 3 weeks ago without realizing the potency of his name in the visitors' list. Then the cards had begun. He had rashly returned some of these calls, and had even accepted an invitation to tea at which 2 cardinals were to be present. And there he had found himself a lion in a den of Daniels. The cardinals had been magnificent, of course, grave, princely men, extremely gracious to this young Catholic baronet, and seeming to understand that he, no more than themselves, really liked this screaming parrot house. One of them had even bidden him use his name with Monsignor Bisletti, if he should wish for a private audience with the Holy Father. But of course, Sir Neville, he had added, with scarcely a trace of an Italian accent, you will find no difficulty in any case. But the rest of the company he did not like so much. It was not that it was different from any other similar company elsewhere. People screamed and gossiped and smelt of furs and eau de cologne. There were meek and trim young men with shining hair. There were tiresome old men who bellowed. There were shy girls, fully as much in London as in Rome. Only he had not expected it in Rome somehow. He had had a faint idea that things would be primitive and quiet here, that he could moon about and look at basilicas now and then, that he could poke round in curiosity shops, in a word, that he could be free here, as he could not in London. And he had found the same old parrot house. It was at this tea party that the Marquis Daly had captured him and introduced him to his wife. And it was here that she had asked him to choose any day in the following week to come to lunch, so soon as she had first caught him saying that he was going to Frascati, but hadn't settled which day. Then you shall lunch with us first, if you will, Sir Neville. Choose your own day, and we'll all go out to Frascati together. Well, here he was. He did not in the least wish to go out to Frascati with all these people. But there was no escape. Here he was, and Mrs. Bessington was telling him about her cousin in Corfu. He was sure now that it could not have been Miss Macpherson. Meanwhile, he was observing the company. Section 2. It had better be said at once that there was a single star in all this gloom of well-disguised boredom. And the name of the star was Enid, who sat opposite him. The Bessingtons, mother and daughter, had been present when the Marchioness had cornered him 4 days ago, and the fact that Mrs. Bessington had added that Enid also wished to see Frascati again had been the one consideration that had prevented him from being rather rude to the Marchioness and saying, untruthfully, that after all it wasn't Frascati but Tivoli, and that he had promised to go with someone else. He had brought her an ice a few minutes before and had sat by her, himself eating another, and she had been to him for 5 minutes like a breath of air in a stuffy room. First, she was extremely pretty, but this, honestly, was not the point. The point was that she had been cool and refreshing and quiet, entirely at her ease, though she could not be more than 19, and had said 1 or 2 odd little things that had been intimate without being familiar. He had forgotten what they were. They were of no importance, but he had perceived that she knew what he was feeling, and that she felt like it too. Then a princess had wished him to be presented to her, and the thing had ended until the invitation. And he had accepted that invitation, aware that he would have prevaricated himself out of it if he had not talked to Enid first. She was nearly opposite him now. She seemed even prettier than he had thought her. She had heavy brown hair, an extremely clear, pale complexion, big grey eyes, and quiet, well-cut lips. She had a large black hat with primroses in it, and a black lace dress, as she was still in mourning for her father. He watched her hands once or twice. He had a theory about hands, and they satisfied him. They were sufficiently large, quite white, and quite strong. Certainly, it would be pleasant to go with her to Frascati. His eyes wandered along the other faces. Next to Enid, on the Marchioness' left, was an Italian priest, the Lenten preacher at a church in the Corso. Neville did not make much of him. He was a new type to the young man, of a very recollected and very well-bred air, as of a guardsman who has become a seminarian. Incidentally, he was a count in his own right, but Neville, with truly British superiority, did not think much of Italian counts. The priest had been quite polished, quite detached, and rather superior in the few words he had with him before they sat down. On the other side of Enid sat Mr. Hecker, an extremely wealthy American, and the husband of Mrs. Hecker. These were his two discernible points, for Mrs. Hecker, who sat on Neville's side of the table, at the further end, was one blaze of intelligence, so bright as to obscure all in her immediate circle. She was really astonishing, thought the boy, as brilliant, and as hard, too, as electric light. He had talked to her a few minutes before lunch, and she had summed up her impressions of Rome simply admirably, touching exactly the right points. The small ancient dignity of the less-known basilicas, the flamboyant triumph of St. Peter's, and the domino houses, as she called them, of the modern municipality. Certainly, these large white flat-faced buildings set with rows of even windows were extraordinarily like dominoes set on end. Only it had not struck him before. Next to him, beyond Mrs. Bessington, was a sleek-haired young man of about his own age, Mr. Clough, who presented precisely the right front to all calls upon him, and who appeared to have nothing whatever behind his front. Neville had put him away all right after 3 minutes, in a pigeonhole already full to bursting. Last but one, opposite Mrs. Hecker, was the Princess Moresky, a small faded lady, rather like a pale Queen Victoria, quite plainly and even shabbily dressed, with an unmistakable dignity, who lived with her imbecile daughter in an enormous palace, the friend of cardinals, blackest of the black, pious, zealous, and resolute, a replica in an Italian disguise of unmarried evangelical daughters and sisters of ancient English dukes, only she was a Catholic and talked 4 languages with equal ease, and they but one. And last came the Marquis Daly himself, the host, whom Neville had put straight into the pigeonhole that contained persons not of his sort, as he would have said, a brisk, anxious man, intensely absorbed in social ambitions, and never quite at his ease anywhere. A papal chamberlain, a papal marquis, without children or estates, pathetically eager to entertain personages so long as they had any kind of claim to distinction and were not militantly anti-Catholic. Such was the company. Neville ran round them mentally once more, wondering when this interminable festivity would be over. "How very nice of her," he said suddenly, perceiving a pause in Mrs. Bessington's conversation, and remembering again the word Corfu. Section 3. What Enid saw, as she made opportunity now and again between the remarks of her Italian priest and the quiet repressed sentences of her American, was a very bright, fresh young man, black-haired and black-eyed, with an indefinable look of slight ill health. She had liked him instantly, as soon as he had sat down beside her with his ice the other day in the window-seat, and had remarked how very odd it was that some ices were so much hotter than others. "If you will consider it carefully," she had said, "with illustrations, I think you will find that it is entirely a matter of texture. It's the hard ones that are cold." He had paused to reflect, with excellent gravity. "That's perfectly true," he had said. "It never occurred to me before. The ones that are like frozen sandstone, aren't they? Now, about colours. Why is Cardinal Scarlet so extraordinarily like flame? Yet it's not the colour of any flame I've ever seen." That was the kind of thing they said at first. He didn't seem at all bored today either, in spite of his situation between the Marchioness and Enid's own mother. Enid had no illusions at all about her mother's conversation. For herself, she did not find it boring, because she had long ago established an understanding, as she would have called it, that she was to go her own way and not to be talked to like that. But she had watched others under it. This young man, however, seemed to preserve his elasticity well enough. Certainly his eyes roved a good deal, but always came back to attention in time. Twice their eyes had met, and she thought she had read a humorous good temper into their glance, yet not enough to be offensive to her mother's daughter. So much for his outward appearance. He seemed natural, breezy, and fresh, in spite of his rather delicate look. He was dressed properly in grey, with a little bunch of violets. She thought he looked simpatico. What she knew about him was very nearly as important. She had learned it from overhearing her mother talking to other people. First, he was a baronet, the fourth of the line, without brothers or sisters, and unmarried. He was aged 23. He was an hereditary Catholic and had been educated at Stonyhurst. His father had died 4 years ago, and his father's sister-in-law, a widow, had kept house ever since at Hartley, and was still doing so. This lady had one boy called Jim, aged 7. Hartley was a fine place in Sussex, and there went with it another big house in Elizabeth Street. That was about the sum of it. Obviously, he was a tolerably wealthy man. There were innumerable other details, too, which her mother had spread abroad, but these were unimportant. For instance, it was said that he was rather delicate and suffered from headaches, that though a Catholic, he was not at all bigoted, that his father had been no better than he should be, though he, too, had died in the faith, that he was just 5 feet and 11.5 inches tall in his stocking feet, that he had broken the public school record for the quarter mile, and that he was one of the 6 or 7 possessors of a tennis court, the real thing, not the pretender, in England, and that he had not distinguished himself at present in any other way whatever, but that it was presumed he would stand for Parliament when he had had time to look about him a bit. Well, these things were not essential. The point was himself, his personality, and his general bearing. These, as has been said, Enid found sympathetic. She was quite glad he was going with them to Frascati this afternoon. She, too, was finding Rome a little trying. It was her 3rd visit, and the least satisfactory. She, too, liked the old better, so far as 3 years ago could be called old. She liked the deep courts, with the iron railings before the crumbling church entrances, with the square of blue sky, the old brickwork displaying all the colours of the scale if you looked for them, the cobblestones, the broken angles of ancient buildings seen against the blue. At least she liked these things so far as she liked anything in a city, and she hated the domino-faced houses and the bulging carved white stone pretensions, and the bell-ringing trams, and the Vittorio Emanuele monument. Yet it seemed to be her fate, she told herself ruefully, to live in cities. Her mother and she left England always in October, and came by stages out to Rome, where they remained till Easter. At least they had done so for the last 3 years. Then, by parallel stages, with intervals at Cannes and Paris, they returned to England about the beginning of June. They were quite well-to-do. There was no anxiety about money. She had an allowance of £300 a year on her own, yet they lived only in a small flat in London, which they let furnished from October to June, and took a country cottage as well. This last was what she most enjoyed, or thought she did, and she would have named as her paradise on earth if she'd been asked, to live always in the English country and to devote herself to nature. But her mother always prevailed somehow, in a blank sort of way, and Paris, Cannes, Rome, Cannes, Paris was their round for the winter. "Yes," she said gravely, in answer to Mr. Hegger's last remark. "I think Italy is just too fascinating, as you say." She had decided 10 minutes ago that she must play up to the American. He would merely think her unintelligent if she didn't agree on such points. The atmosphere is extraordinary. Mrs. Hecker was saying something about it, about all the strata of paganism and primitive Christianity, and the papacy and cinematographs, all laid one on top of the other. "It's all wonderful to us," said Mr. Hecker, with submissive admiration. "But of course for you Europeans, it's part of the air you breathe all the time." She assented in precisely the right terms, and caught Sir Neville's eye again, and a delightful little thrill went through her. Obviously he had overheard, and, no less obviously, had understood her position. Enid was a lonely soul, and she could not understand why. She had every possible charm, and no drawbacks so far as she knew. But it appeared to her that people were disappointing. They took to her violently. They called her by her Christian name remarkably soon, and she also, she thought, took to them. And then something happened once, especially when an engagement had been broken off. They misunderstood, or they found grave offence where she had intended none. They sheered off. She was not yet cynical, but she wondered sometimes whether she were not in danger of becoming so. People were oddly disappointing and fickle. She was beginning to take refuge in a kind of mystical solitude. Such was the account of herself and the world that she would have given, in all honesty, if there had been anyone she could confide in. But at present there was nobody. "I must remember that if I ever go to Corfu," she heard the young man opposite say. "It's extremely—" No, Sir Neville, not Corfu. She had that experience at Greenwich. I always say—" Across the flow that once more poured forth, she heard hasty apologies beginning, unheard, and, for the life of her, could not help glancing up. He was plainly a little agitated. Once more his eyes flickered up and met her own, and there was an amused kind of consternation in them. She permitted herself a delicate little smile. She knew so perfectly what was happening. She had so often witnessed it before, under stress of her mother's conversation. Section 4. He was beside her with an admirable easy art so soon as he had deposited her mother in the adjoining sitting-room. The Marquis was most particular to follow the Italian custom of sending everyone out in pairs as they had come in, and she felt a gentle pleasure in his kind, frank eyes that looked so simply into her own. Round them rose again the noise of the parrot-house. "My word, it's warm," he said. They were standing in the window, half hidden by the heavy damask curtains deemed proper to Roman hotels. "The motors are 10 minutes late already," she said. "Or perhaps it's us. We were to start at 2. You know Frascati, don't you?" "Oh, yes." "I wish you'd show me round," he said, "when we get there. Somehow luncheon parties, however pleasant—" He stopped in slight confusion. It was plain that he suddenly remembered that Mrs. Bessington was her mother. She smiled with delicious frankness. "Yes, my mother does talk, doesn't she?" A very faint look of surprise came into his face. "But she's simply a dear, isn't she?" she went on without perceptible pause. She was quite aware of her desire to please this young man. Perhaps she had been a shade too precipitate in seeming to criticize her mother to him, so she was relieved to see his face change again. "I could hardly say that, could I?" he said. She seems to have travelled a lot. Corfu, you know, and places like that." Again she smiled. Really, they were getting on very well. Enid thought to herself, rather subtle, and it was a pleasure to perceive how quickly his personality answered hers. The relief from the conventions she had found it necessary to assume with Mr. Hecker was considerable. "Well, it's Frascati now anyhow, isn't it? Mother always forgets whether she means Albano or not." "It's Tivoli with me," said the boy. "I know there's a waterfall there, and a villa, but I forget whether it's the d'Este one or Hadrian's. It's very confusing, don't you think? She set him right, deliberately and clearly. He was to keep firmly in his mind that Frascati had had an English cardinal as its bishop, two in fact, the steward and the other. Their arms were all over the place, and there was Cicero's school too that he mustn't forget. That was up in the woods. Well, you'll give me all the information when we get there, won't you? I can't think. He stopped, as if a little confused. I think I know what you were going to say, said Enid. You couldn't, possibly. Well, wasn't it that it's the things that matter, and not the information about them? His face showed a pleased bewilderment. That's simply extraordinary, he said. That's precisely what I was going to say. How could you tell? She looked him fairly in the face for a perceptible pause. Oh, it's obvious that that's what you feel about things, she said. Then the Marquis proclaimed from the door that the motors were round, and Enid dutifully attached herself to her mother again.